Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to New Books in American Studies. I'm your host, Ryan Shelton, and today it's my pleasure to be joined by Monica D. Fitzgerald, author of Puritans Behaving Badly: Gender, Punishment, and Religion in Early America, just published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. Monica is a professor in the Justice, Community, and Leadership program at St. Mary's College of California. Monica, congratulations on the book and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited about the book. I'm really excited to be here with you today. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. Before we get into the book, Puritans Behaving Badly, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I am a historian of early America. I got my PhD at the University of California, Davis. It was a wonderful, wonderful place. As an undergrad, I actually was a political theory major. And when I decided to go back to grad school, I didn't think that the political theory was going to have the answers I wanted. And I really wanted to transition to history. And so before I did that, I went and got a master's in history at California State University, East Bay. And that's actually where I fell in love with early American history. So I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. St. Mary's College is a small liberal arts school in the East Bay, kind of in the on the Oakland Hills. And so I've lived up in the Bay Area. I'm a native Californian. I came to the Bay Area to do my undergrad at Cal, UC Berkeley, and stayed. I love it in the Bay Area. And I have two kids, an actor daughter who lives in New York, and a son who just graduated and is looking to actually get into politics. So that's kind of a little bit of my trajectory.
Well, that's wonderful, Monica. So, there's so many ways that we could kind of dive into your book, but maybe as a way to start, you explore the disciplinary records in these church books in early Puritan America and are looking at these records of church discipline cases. Could you maybe just start by telling us a little bit about your research methodology and what it was that you were actually drawing your study on?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's amazing. These church disciplinary records haven't really been explored. There was one historian in the 1950s, Neil Oberholzer, who sort of looked at them and just kind of chronicled them. But there's never been sort of any sort of study, especially a gendered analysis of it. And I actually came across the idea of looking at these records. I knew I wanted to do something about gender and religion in early America, and I was really drawn to a couple of arguments. Historian David Hall writes what he calls about the daily lived religion. And I was really drawn to that, but wanted kind of to do a gendered daily lived religion. I really felt like that there was something there that was unexplored. And so my advisor at the time for my dissertation, Alan Taylor, said, often look in the bibliography of one of your favorite books, because oftentimes they'll give you advice or they'll say, someone should be looking at this, right? And so for me, it was Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who I think that's why I fell in love with early American history. Her first book, Good Wives, and then, of course, Midwife's Tale. And in the back of her book, Good Wives, that came out in 1980, she wrote in a little note that, someone really should look at these church records, church disciplinary records. That was it. One line in a bibliography. And and I was really drawn to it because they're just these little vignettes. I mean, one of the reasons I think that people haven't looked at it necessarily is because you might have church records missing from one church for a while. They're not always consistent. Sometimes it depended on who the pastor was, whether or not they actually recorded the confessions. So there are all sorts of things that make them somewhat difficult. But it also, you still can see the patterns over time in them.
Mhm.
But the beautiful thing, right, is if you're looking at daily lived religion, daily lived experience, there's nothing better than actually reading the voices of ordinary people, right? I mean, talk about something that is extraordinary. And so you ended up having these amazing vignettes. And think about how vulnerable it is when somebody has to actually stand up and confess something they did wrong to their entire congregation. And there was so much theater and drama that was brought with it, but it was also a mechanism for storytelling. And I was really drawn to creating kind of narratives that could draw people in to help understand. And so, as you know in the book, each chapter starts with a vignette, a story to kind of help. And then I try to, take it apart and analyze it. But they really are extraordinary. They're extraordinary records. And so, I spent a fair amount of time in New England, archives, and looking at these church records. And it revealed so much, and of course took me down lanes that I wasn't anticipating. And one of the early ones being is how gendered the language was in these confessions. And then, of course, what unrolled from then is sort of the gendered expectations that ministers and the congregation had in someone's confession. And so it kind of unrolled from there, because I really was very interested in kind of the radical potential of Protestantism, right, in terms of gender. And we saw, the Quakers did embrace a much more radical gender ideas and much more equality. And I always saw that potential in Puritanism. And I've been like, why did Puritanism not adopt kind of more gender equity? And so this kind of really opened the door to really be able to explore that through these stories, and being able to recognize the patterns that emerge in, the kinds of things people are accused of. Obviously, in my book, a lot ends up being, fornicating and drinking, right? The two big gendered sins. So that's kind of how it all began, really, with an entry in a bibliography. So, shout out to Laura Thatcher Ulrich, and hope, it made me realize, how can I pay it forward and give readers an idea of things that are still unexplored.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so if anyone's listening right now and is looking for a dissertation topic, we can say, take a look at some bibliographies and see what the
Right.
suggestions
Absolutely.
are. Yeah, Monica, you used the word vignette, and I think that is one of the things that makes your book so charming, is all of these little insights into lived experiences in a way that they just pop right off the page. Your first chapter starts with this unforgettable image of chickens and chamber pots in Dorchester. So maybe could you tell us a little bit, to set the scene of how this starts to really tell us what's happening in the growing rift between clergy and laity among this first generation of Puritans that really sets up your case study of Puritans' evolving understandings of gender?
Yeah. Well, and that story of the great hen squabble, as I call it, and in the article that preceded the book, that was actually one of the titles of the article, is Drunkards, Fornicators, and the Great Hen Squabble, which they didn't call it the Great Hen Squabble. That was all me, but I do like titles. Well, yeah, and I think that that story, the chamber pot story, and honestly, when I would go to conferences, I would have a chamber pot, because why not, right? Just to show. I obviously, that the chamber pot story. First of all, is so easy for people to visualize, right? I mean, you could just picture, and I also thought it was a way to show a reading audience, to illustrate to a reading audience um, the lack of privacy that existed at this time. That it isn't unexpected that chickens are going to wander into your house that belong to your neighbor, right? Um, but also, it's such a great story because I think anyone who writes about Puritans, one of the things that you always have to overcome from an audience is just this idea that the Puritans were like um, boring, they didn't enjoy fun, and this story just, you see these women catfighting, right? I know that's actually catfighting is a very gendered term, but you see them going at each other and bringing their servant and their daughter into it. But you can see the neighborly buildup of the tension, right, that exists. So I really felt like this story was a way for people to see, okay, these are real people. This is not some caricature of, from an Arthur Miller play or something, that these are real people with real problems. But then, of course, you get down to the root of the issue of all the things that could have happened, and you could have been sued for this or that with private property and the chickens, is that came down to a woman lying. And I thought, that, I mean, first of all, it completely resonates today, which is really primary for me. But that you start out with this story is that a woman's tongue, like a woman telling a simple lie, then escalates this and gets her censured, right? And so I think that opens up the book in a way that enables the readers to immediately see, oh, that line, right? And many more women get censured or disciplined for lying than men because there's something distrustful about women. And of course, at the end of the book, the story of Anne Hibbins, you see what trouble a woman's tongue can get her in, women's speech, how dangerous it is. So that kind of sets up that narrative. And in a similar way, I think one of my favorite stories is the introduction where Content Mason is running away with her lover, right? And then, but she comes back and kind of becomes a member of the community again and is redeemed. And, her daughter marries an upstanding minister and that sort of thing. So trying to just illustrate all the ways that so many things we struggle with or think about or worry about today, the very humanness of our condition was also true for these folks. Because the reason I'm interested in early America is because I believe that for us to kind of dismantle and uproot some of our issues today, we have to historicize it and understand the roots and the beginnings of it, right? So for me, history is storytelling from the past, but in order to impact today. And I think making the Puritans relatable through these vignettes was critical for me.
Yeah, so you start to move. So from chapter 1, you move in chapter 2 to start to analyze. There are different sins that are showing up in these church discipline cases between women and men. What does that tell us about the way that religion and Puritan piety was starting to be expressed in different ways between women and lay men, and ministers exist in this kind of third category between them?
Right. Yeah, and that gets at sort of, really exploring how Puritanism became gendered, because I think there was an expectation, certainly from the ministers, certainly, coming to New England, that all, as, just, for folks who don't know, is that out of the Protestant Reformation, and Puritans adapted this idea that all souls are equal, and it really kind of opened things up. And you see it Quakers taking a much more radical approach with more gender equity because of that. So you have this idea in these covenants that every church founded, was that there were two parts of it. You had personal piety, right? You were supposed to do particular things to express your personal piety, but also there was this sense of duty to the whole, right? And men and women were supposed to do both of those. The ministers preached this idea of both aspects of the covenant be expressed by both people, by both genders. But what we see in reality, right, is that, and I argue that really laymen who, because they voted on church censures, and women didn't get to vote, that laymen really undermined that expression for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into. But that when you look at the vast majority of the sins, you can delineate them in between drinking and fornicating. Now, you would expect, if you were a statistician, that an equal number of men and women, generally in the 17th century, would have been charged for illicit sex. But men were very rarely charged. Most of the time, if they were censured for sex outside of marriage, it's because they came to confess with their wife that they had sex before they got married. Very rarely does a single man come on his own, but constantly we see women having to come confess. And it gets into this idea around, obviously, right, controlling women's bodies, policing women's bodies in ways that you don't police men, or the expectation of purity for women that didn't necessarily exist for men. And I'll get into the language in a little bit, but with drinking, Puritans really didn't care if someone drank themselves overdrank in private, right? What they didn't care when they're doing their own home. And we have to realize during this time, beer was safer than water, right? So, people were drinking beer all day long, right? So, but it's this public performance aspect of being drunk in public that became so identified with men. And it was easier for men to censure other men for drinking, which was already a perceived masculine sort of thing, right? Women owned taverns, but women didn't necessarily go to taverns to drink, right? Whereas that was a very male space. And so policing men in that way became much easier. But what's interesting is, for men charged with drunkenness, it was considered a dereliction of duty, whereas women censured for having sex outside of marriage, it was considered an internal sin, a sin of piety. So you see this divide, and we see it over and over again, that even if men and women are charged with the same kind of sin, say lying is one that men and women could be charged with, is that it was considered a corruption of her nature or her soul that she sinned, whereas for men it was likely some external thing that rationalized their behavior. So you immediately get this divide in the way men and women are censured, in the types of censures they have, and the expectation around their confession, that women have to examine their soul and men examine their behavior. And that divide became so apparent to me so early on. And it gets to, right, sort of this idea of public performance and private, right, which eventually becomes this public-private dichotomy, right? But very early on, that it was women's corrupt natures, but men's aberrant behavior And we see that. So that chapter on drinking and fornicating, on gendered sin and discipline, is a really good way of illustrating that to the reader, this real divide that men were not laymen never expected other laymen to stand up in church and interrogate the nature of their soul, right? But women were expected to do that in ways, as you read some of these confessions, that were really self-critical and demeaning, really interrogating their natures and talking about how corrupt they are, and begging the congregation, to forgive them and that they erred, whereas men speak in a much less what I'm trying to think of the right word for it. You would think I would know, but men speak in a much more like legalese kind of way about their sin, as opposed to women. Women were expected to be really self-critical and self-reflective, whereas men, it's like, what did they do wrong to their community? So for all of these men, of course, there's I love the story of consider Atherton, right? Who that leads chapter 2, right? Who ends up drunk in a ditch, right? And somebody comes along and finds him because he's passed out. And he came from this prominent family, and over again, he had these episodes of public drunkenness. I mean, if anyone probably had some, internal nature problems, it was Consider. But instead of really interrogating the state of his soul, it was like, how did he let his community down by getting drunk? Right? How did he fail in his duty to his community? Whereas, as opposed to women and fornicating. So I thought that was a great gender divide to really get at the heart of what I see as important differences that develop in the first 3 generations.
Yeah, that's right. And so while you have these little vignettes, you really close with these 2 larger case studies. As this emergence of masculinity and femininity become more and more entrenched in this culture, the first case study is John Underhill. So who is John Underhill, and what does his story tell us about this emerging lay Puritan male masculinity?
Yeah, I mean, oh my goodness, he is such a character, and probably one of the Puritans, one of the people in my book that people might have heard of the most. So Captain John Underhill was, at the time, an acclaimed war hero for massacring the Pequot Indians. So we now talk about it as a genocide, but he really became famous for that. When I first outlined this book, I didn't have these 2 final chapters in it. But what I realized is, how can I, take a case study of a person, rather than a town, because I look at these towns, take a case study of a person to really dig deep and illuminate kind of the tensions. And John Underhill became such the perfect man to do this with. And it really opened up, in terms of looking at, gender studies in masculinity in early America are really just emerging. Some scholars doing some really great work now. And it has really opened up this door to me of looking at masculinity in different contexts in early America. But what we have here for John Underhill, he was trained to be a warrior. All right. And so what I argue is that he represents this sort of hypermasculinity, right? And we understand that we talk about hypermasculinity today all the time, right? In terms of some gendered issues of today. But this idea of the soldier, right, with the supposed to be this super hypermasculine hero, right, aggressive, and we see hypermasculinity celebrated in certain contexts in the way we talk about conquerors, right? When we talk, the language we use about conquering the so-called New World, is this very masculine language that is not only rooted in violence, but sexual prowess and sexual conquest. And John Underhill has all of that. He was, trained as a military. He was trained in a military academy. He was successful against the Pequods, rose as this captain, also a womanizer, right? So he had this whole package as a hypermasculine. And in many contexts, he would have, been awarded a lot of money and become a leader in his community. And I think that that's what he expected. John Underhill expected after what he did with the war that he would become this hero and this leader in Boston. But what was happening is Puritans, especially ministers, prescribed a more tempered kind of masculinity, right? And there's lots of ways when you really look at Puritans, and plenty of amazing historians that I have learned from and grown from and used in my book talk about Puritanism being a feminized religion, right? And we get at this whole idea of piety and introspection, and the ministers use a lot of feminized language to talk about religion. So here you have this hyper masculinity that celebrated war hero, yet now you have this religion that's calling for a more tempered, humble, feminine masculinity, feminized masculinity. And that comes into conflict. I mean, that really is the heart of this. And that's been super interesting for me because I had not explored masculinity as much earlier in my grad work. But really, that is the crux of it, is that laymen were in the middle of this. They couldn't accept the sort of feminized spirituality that ministers wanted, but you couldn't build a church and society with the hyper masculinity that John Underhill had. And so I call it the middle ground of masculinity. And that's from an early, that's taking a concept by another historian about the middle ground in early America, but I call this the middle ground of masculinity. And that's what laymen were trying to do. So the story of John Underhill, he gets basically, he's excommunicated from the church for having an affair. And honestly, like, he is so, I mean, he would be, I'm always trying to think of what's a contemporary figure, because he was so arrogant. He had such hubris. He had such a sense of power and privilege, right? Like, as being the war hero, he had an affair with a ton of women. Like, he was the guy's guy, right? Like, there's no other way to talk about it. So he gets excommunicated for having an affair. And basically his confession was, I tried to stay away from her, but no one can, not succumb to me because I'm just so hot. And that was his apology to this woman's husband, right? So he has such hubris that he's not able to understand the nuances of the expectations around gender. So he gets excommunicated. He loses everything. He goes off and he goes to Dover, where they actually, because he's a war hero, they make him a governor and tell everybody in Massachusetts rights, or in Boston rights, and says, do you know, this guy's excommunicated? So he loses everything again. So he finally then comes back to Boston. He's like, I'm gonna give you. He tried another time, bad confession, because they really wanted it to be sincere, right? And he couldn't quite get that sincerity, right? Because fundamentally he doesn't think he ever really did anything wrong. So he's just trying to check a box. So then this is the only case I found of a man really trying to perform confession with a feminized demeanor. So he comes in, clothes were really important to him. And so he usually was very well dressed. I mean, if you look back at his lineage, there's a whole Underhill society. If you look back at his lineage, his grandfather was the keeper of the wardrobe, right? So, and it was a marker of identity, as we know. So instead he comes into church wearing, just a woolen hat, and he looks a wreck, and he looks just beaten up and demoralized, and kind of, I think they say pathetic. that he looked pathetic, and he gave this crying sort of confession, but it worked. He was relieved of his excommunication. He never got his status back in New England at all. But I think that there's a few stories of men in these records where, they just end up leaving because they can't temper their masculinity, whether they're womanizers or war heroes. And so I really thought that John Underhill was such a great representative of these competing masculinities. And I don't think that we talk about that enough, and how problematic it is when you don't fit and you can't.
Yeah, you talk about these competing masculinities, which really expose this growing rift between laymen and the clergy in particular. Then the next episode starts to again show that this rift between the laymen who are deciding these church discipline cases and the ministers who have their own version of ethics and norms plays out in a marked way in the trial of Ann Hibbins. So to tell us a little bit about who this person is and how this starts to wrap up your case study in Puritan gendered piety.
Yeah, the story of Ann Hibbins is just amazing, and it's also one of those. Why don't people know her story more? I wanted to just put a huge spotlight on her because I think it's so remarkable what happened to her, and I also find like so many women could relate today to the sexism and the misogyny, right? So, and it's also an interesting story because she came from she was a wealthy woman. I mean, her and her husband had good standing in the community, and so her story really, I mean, she had contractors come in, and she didn't like their work, and at the end of the day, she was hung as a witch. And it's what the story of how all of this unravels is so compelling and such a great case study of what happens in a society where women, can't claim power, right? So she ends up getting censured, and she's angry because why am I being called out? He didn't do work. She got censured for undermining a man's business reputation. So that's why she got censured, because she was defaming this contractor who did a poor job. And it seems to me that her and her husband have a really good relationship where he let her have control over this, right? So this was not something where he thought his wife was going out of the boundaries of their marriage and behaving in a way that wasn't acceptable. So it seems like they had this kind of relationship that gave her sort of the autonomy to take care of this household matter. So the men and the laymen in the congregation voting on this, basically send her away and say, you better come back and do a better job. And she was trying to figure out what they really wanted. So at one point she asked, can I do a written confession? Because, that way, and they're like, no, you need to speak to us and you need to confess in front of us. And then it was basically one of those back and forth, like, you need to apologize. Well, I'm trying to talk. They kept shutting her up and interrupting her. They wouldn't let her speak. And she actually called them out on it. Like, you are asking me to explain myself. I'm trying to explain myself, yet you shut me up every time. Because they only wanted her to say what they wanted her to say. They didn't really want to hear her side of anything. And, at one point her husband tries to intervene, in a way of like, hey, let me try to explain what she really means here. Like, trying to smooth things over. And then, she gets excommunicated. Nothing much really happens. until her husband dies. Years later, when her husband died, they never really forgot that she was just this uppity woman who didn't know her place, and she had offended so many men in the community that she was charged with witchcraft. And I don't know if you've ever read. There's Carol Carlson has this great book um, that really explains sort of the issue around women and witchcraft and widowed women with no inheriting sons, and that they had this level of power. So oftentimes it wasn't that outlier poor woman, on the edge of town that was accused of witchcraft, right? It was like women who had potential power that was seen as a threat. So Anne Hibbins spent her adult life being ridiculed by the community, excommunicated, outcast for her outspokenness and her unwillingness to submit. And she's walking by a group of people, and she said, "I know you're talking about me." And they said, "The only way you would know we're talking about you is if you were a witch." And not that, of course, they're talking about her. They've spent the last, decade talking about her, right? For that, she was actually hung as a witch. But it's something they had wanted to do from the time that she would not submit. And without the protection of her husband, she was accused of witchcraft. It is a remarkable story because she was, a strong member of the community. And she really just withstood her ground, and it cost her.
Yeah, you include this afterward. I think was it from the minister John Norton, who was reported to have been at a dinner party commenting on this. Even though the magistrates and the ministers tried to intervene in this case, they just couldn't kind of calm the mob. But I think it was what was his comment that she was hung as a witch for being cleverer than other people or something like that. Right. It was just this tragic.
Isn't that a great quote? I couldn't, it's the kind of a quote you find it and you're like, you just wrapped up my whole story for me, right? What I think is interesting, because of course her original riff was with a contractor. And so there's an interesting class element here, which you don't necessarily find in a lot of the confessions. But she did have some of the wealthier men in the community that tried to save her and thought that this was unacceptable. But a lot of the laymen who had all sorts of resentments also resented her going after this, contractor, and that played a role in it because I do think some of the people who tried to defend her, the men who tried to defend her, were wealthier of her class and had been friends with her, but their status was not enough to make a difference in that trial.
Talk about a populist backlash.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what you touched on this at the beginning of the story with Anne Hibbins, that she had this remarkable amount of autonomy. And in the first generations of Puritans, the kind of very distinct gendered roles don't seem to be so much at play. But this is something that you're just noticing is emerging over the three generations. So just kind of wrapping all of this up, so we see that there's this trajectory happening that's gender roles are being constructed in these three subsequent generations of Puritans. Is that an accurate summary of what the story that you're seeing playing out here?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some other really great historians that I cite in my book that talk about sort of the fluidity of gender in the early 17th century. And certainly Laura Thatcher Ulrich was one of the first with her book on Good Wives. But that, again, right, in order to create community, build community, when they migrated here, you needed roles. Women needed to have larger roles in order to help build the community and sustain the family and grow, right? And Laura Thatcher Ulrich actually wrote this about this idea that women actually were deputy husbands, that, they could sign contracts on behalf of their husbands, that they had a lot of kind of autonomy that way and power that way out of necessity, right? But also too is that we see with the church being the center of public life and women having a sense of at least, identity and informal power in those spaces, that as long as the church was the public place, women were elevated in some degrees because of their church status. And so, gender historians have looked at different moments in time where we begin to see sort of this dichotomy or the separate spheres ideology, as it's called, that we thought really happened in the 19th century with industrialization, that men entered the public world and women were relegated to the private world, right? But what we really see is the steps leading to that. Then that's a huge point in my book. The construction of modern gender ideologies really did start then, where you begin to see men being focused on for their public roles, right? Their duty, their Puritan duty, where women were really meant to be more internal. And then, of course, after 1692, when the church didn't have public power anymore, and women were relegated to the private sphere of the church, right? And men to the big public sphere, right? And that's when you really begin to see church membership become much more female only, because men could express their public duty and their religiosity through those public roles. And that's where, so we begin. So one of the arguments of my book is that the shift actually starts earlier than we thought, in a place we weren't really looking, in the church itself.
Well, it's a fascinating story that you tell, and I'm sure that anyone listening is already well aware that there's plenty of colorful stories ready to be enjoyed throughout the book. So, Monica, you've been incredibly kind in coming to talk with us about your book. I'm curious, before we go, what are you working on at the moment? What can we be looking forward to from you?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, I actually, through this work, I'm continuing to really look at the expressions of masculinity and the impact that had on Puritanism and public space and in early New England. And so Robert Keene is another merchant. He actually is one who recorded a lot of what we have about Ann Hibbins, because he wrote it down in his journal. And he was censured basically for price gouging, essentially. And so kind of working with a colleague to really kind of interrogate that and use that as a lens to kind of dig deeper into contested masculinity in early America is something that I'm starting, early on. As it's the early, pre-chapter outline phases of what that might look like.
Wonderful. Well, I'm so excited to follow that project, and I can't wait to read it once it's ready to come out. Well, this has been a delight. We've been talking with Monica D. Fitzgerald about her book, Puritans Behaving Badly: Gender, Punishment, and Religion in Early America, available now from Cambridge University Press. Monica, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It was a joy to talk with you. I so appreciate it.
And thanks for listening to this episode of the New Books Network. If you enjoyed this podcast, I invite you to like and rate, subscribe, do all of those normal podcasty things. But the most important thing is, if there's anyone that you can think of who would find this episode interesting, send it along to them, spread the word about what we're trying to do here at the New Books Network. That's it for now. I hope you have a great day.